All right, now let's create our first view or view function. So here in the Movies app, let's open up views.py and define a function called index. Now, this name is arbitrary. We could call it anything, but usually we use the word index for naming the function that represents the main page of an app. For example, here in our Movies app, when we send a request to this address, to this endpoint, our index function is going to get called. So index represents the main page of an app. Now, all our view functions should take a parameter called request. Again, the name is arbitrary, but the object that is passed to this function is an HTTP request object. We are not going to call this function. Django will take care of doing this. So when we send an HTTP request to an endpoint, Django will figure out, based on some configuration, what view function should be called. You're going to see that in a minute. Now, in every view function, we should return an HTTP response. So on the top, first, let's import the HTTP response class from Django.http module. So import HTTP response. Okay. Now, in this function, we're going to return an HTTP response object. Here, I'm going to pass some plain text like hello world and save the changes. Okay, this is our first view. Now we need to map this to a URL. So back in the Movies app, let's add a new file. By convention, the name of this file should be urls.py. So make sure to spell it properly. In this file, we're going to create a variable called URL patterns that we should set to a list. Again, this is one of the conventions that Django expects us to follow. In this list, we add objects that map URL endpoints to our view functions. And for that, we use the path function in Django. So on the top, from Django.urls, let's import the path function. So we call the path function here to create a path object. As the first argument, we should specify a URL endpoint. Here I'm going to use an empty string, and this will represent the root of this app. For example, in our Movies app, we're going to have URL endpoints like this. Movies / that's the root URL. We're going to have movies /1 /detail. Here I'm assuming 1 is the ID of a given movie. So here an empty string represents the root of this app. Now don't worry about the movies prefix. We're going to add that in the next step. From the perspective of this app, we don't care what the prefix is because we should design these apps for reusability. So maybe another developer wants to download our app from pypi.org and put it under a URL like movies collection. This app shouldn't care where it's hosted. So here we use relative URLs. Okay. Now let's delete these. So this is the root of this app. Now we need to map this to a view function. So we need to import the index function that we created earlier. That is in our views module. So look, the views module is here. So you might think we can import the views module like this. Now, while this is possible in pure Python world, this will not work in Django because of how Django loads these modules. Also, there is a problem with importing the views module like this because it is possible that the application that hosts this app is dependent on a module called views. So with this statement, we'll end up importing the views module that is in the path. That is different from the views module we have inside of this directory. So here we should use a relative import statement. So from period to represent the current directory, import the views module. That is better. Now back to our path function. As the second argument, we need to pass a reference to a view function. That is views.index. Note that I'm not calling this function. I'm simply passing a reference to it. At runtime, when a user sends an HTTP request to this endpoint, Django will take care of calling this function and give it an HTTP request object. Okay? Now, also as a best practice, we should name these URL endpoints. So here we pass a keyword argument, name, we set it to index. So save the changes. We define this variable URL patterns that contains one or more path objects that map URL endpoints to view functions. We refer to this as a URL configuration. So every app should have a URL configuration. So we're done with configuring URLs for this app, but our main app, the Vidl app, has no knowledge of the Movies app. So if we head over to localhost port 8000/movies, nothing is going to happen. Our Django application is not aware of that. So we have to go to the main app, that is Vidly. See, once again here we have urls.py that defines the URL configuration for our main app. So see here we have URL patterns. By convention, Django looks for this variable when starting our Django project. So make sure to spell this variable exactly as you see here. Now, here in this module, we have a path that maps anything that starts with admin to admin.site.urls. So every Django project comes with an administrative panel. That is a separate, independent app on its own. We're going to look at that in the future. So here in this list, we need to add a new path object. We're going to tell our Vidly app that any path that starts with movies should be handed off to the URL configuration in the Movies app. So here on line 17, from Django.urls, we should import another function that is called include. And here we call that function and pass a string that specifies the name of the module that contains the URL configuration for the Movies app. That is movies.url. So look, we have this movies directory. Inside of this directory, we have urls.py. That is why here we need to pass a string movies.url. But we don't add .py because Django will automatically append the extension and load this module. So with this line, whenever we send a request that starts with movies, Django will chop off the prefix, that is what we have here, and send the remaining string to this module, movies.url. That is the reason in the URL configuration for the Movies app, we use an empty string to represent the root of this app. Okay, so back to urls.py. Let's save the changes and restart our web server. So here on the terminal, let's run Python 3 manage.py run server. We got this error, no module named movies.url. Actually, I made a mistake. I should have passed movies.urls. We have an S at the end. So once again, let's run our web server. Beautiful. Now, if you head over to the homepage of our website, you're going to see a page not found error. Don't worry about that. We're going to fix that shortly. But if you head over to /movies, you're going to see the hello world message. And this verifies that we successfully mapped a URL endpoint to a view function.